everybody. I'm Mike Towers. I'm the Chief Security and Trust Officer at Veza, and I look forward to talking to you today about modern identity security, this concept of intelligent access, and a brand new data model that we think is important that we call the access graph. I come to you after about 20 years of experience as an enterprise CISO and trust officer, and I joined Veza about a year ago, truly and with all intentions to disrupt the identity security space, which in my opinion needs that disruption. It's not an area that has gotten a lot of innovation recently, and there's important innovation that's needed, and we'll talk about that shortly. So today we'll talk about what I would classify as the identity security challenge of today. We'll talk a little bit about how a lot of our technology architectures and the technology ecosystem overall has evolved. I'll mention this new data model that is critically important to where we think that identity security needs to go. We call it the access graph. We'll talk a little bit about implementation and value creation. How do we get this new concept in place? How do we get impact and outcomes from this new model, and how does it change and how does it impact the way that we operate moving forward? There's an important concept I think many of us who have been doing security for a while recognize, which is called least privilege. We'll talk about what that looks like in this new world and where we want to focus on least privilege, and this concept of intelligent access, which is how all of this comes together. And then we'll close from there. So the problem statement, I always like to start with a problem statement, is to just ground us here a little bit, is in a number of areas. We'll get into a lot of these details as we walk through these materials in this session. But the bottom line is that our modern data-driven and digital world is really, really stretching us when it comes to identity security. And those challenges are making it tough to sustain and to keep up with. And a lot of that has to do with the rapid proliferation of integrations, platforms, payment systems. There's a pretty complex mesh of employees, customers, partners. The attack surface continues to grow, given this variability, given this rapid growth. We all recognize that there's mounting regulatory pressure, and those regulations keep growing and keep evolving across the world. And none of the solutions that we're using were designed with all of this speed and variability that we have and that we're faced with. So a lot of the existing solutions just are inadequate. So we need to think about how to take this more modern approach. We need to cut through this platform complexity. We need to leverage the power of visibility, real-time intelligence, and we need to turn into an enabler and allow our businesses and allow our financial institutions to grow and operate and thrive in today's data-driven and digital world without being an encumbrance and without slowing things down, and we want to make sure that we do all of that with continuous compliance. So why is this important now? So like anything else, one of the things is there's a lot of opportunities to do things. Many of us have more to do than we have time or resources to do them in. But part of the reason why this is so important to address is that, like I said, our existing processes and tools are breaking down, and they just frankly can't scale. The transformation that many of our businesses are going through demands a new identity security approach. There's all sorts of fraud and account takeover attempts, and the complexity and the sophistication continues to grow both in capability and in speed and in breadth. A lot of the interconnectivity between our technology platforms is creating unprecedented challenges. The real-time nature of our business requires more robust controls. As I mentioned before, the regulatory landscape continues to evolve and grow quickly. And we must be in a position as CISOs and our teams to appropriately balance innovation and maintain that level of compliance. And organizations are struggling, frankly. This is an exponential growth in a lot of these complexities, in speed, in variability. And we need to figure out how to do this and be a partner to the business to do it and maintain the level of trust and control of our data and digital estate. So let's talk a little bit about why the traditional solutions that we've been working with for a while are falling short, frankly. And what you see on the slide here is a little bit of a quick history lesson, but there's been a lot of innovation in the cybersecurity space. If you go back to the 2000s, we had what we called at the time next generation firewalls. There was a lot of innovation in the network security space. Companies like Palo Alto were very instrumental in driving that alongside others like Checkpoint. 2010s came along and we started to see things move to the cloud and leverage the cloud. whether it was Zscaler moving proxy to the cloud, Okta moving identity to the cloud, CrowdStrike doing a lot of EDR and malware detection in the cloud. So we were leveraging the power and elasticity of cloud. And then over time, we started to see multi-clouds. We started to see multi-identity. There was a lot of innovation in things like single sign-on and multi-factor authentication. But despite a lot of investments that we've made over the years in various parts of identity security, whether it's the governance and administration side, the privileged access management side, even on the data protection side, we still struggle and frankly can't fundamentally answer the question, who can take what action on what data? And one of the reasons, a few of the primary reasons for that is that we have some outdated data models, we don't have enough visibility, and we can't move at the level of speed, and we're not dynamic enough to adjust to the speed at which these platforms operate. Let's take a look at a modern enterprise landscape. Many of us who've been doing this for a while remember the days where most organizations were run maybe by a couple of transactional systems, and maybe you had Active Directory to drive your computing environment on premise. But nowadays, there's a significant amount of variability and there's a significant amount of change, much of which, frankly, we don't have nearly as much control over as we used to. So you have your identity landscape, you have your authentication landscape, like I mentioned, you have your front door authorization, like I call it, you have various systems and solutions that may be providing your human capital management, whether it's Workday or whether you have a separate system that's driving your contingent workforce. And then on the back end, if you will, the targets, you have cloud, you have SaaS, you have data platforms, and we all still have on-premise systems. Many of us have a significant amount of on-premise landscape. And this is a big, big challenge, and it's constantly growing rapidly when you start thinking about our core banking platforms, trading systems, payment processing systems, wealth management. All of this is a level of variability that it's tough to keep up with. And you see some stats here on the screen. The average enterprise has over 360 SaaS applications and uses over 1,200 cloud services. That is a big, big level of variability. And a lot of the way that these platforms operate, frankly, aren't very consistent, which is also driving some of the challenges that we have. So that's how the modern enterprise looks and how the technology ecosystem has evolved. But our legacy, I'll call it identity tools, the identity tools we've been using for a while, they can't cope with that environment I just described. And the main reason is they share a fundamental flaw. They're basically based on a data model of directories. They're a tree structure. Directories basically have users and groups. In a lot of respects, it looks like an HR org chart. Maybe there's a relational database that helps from a data structure perspective. But you have users and groups, and you put users in groups to help things get organized. And that's basically what the advantages of a directory-based approach is. It helps organize the data. But on the right side of this slide, you see this concept of roles, permissions, and resources, which our theory and our hypothesis and my hypothesis of why we struggle in this space, the true picture of security is the aggregation of roles, permissions, and resources that our organization's users have access to. Permissions define access. Permissions define security. Users and groups, like I said, are great for organization. They do nothing for security. Security is derived by the aggregate permissions that you have across all of the resources that you have access to, across the various platforms that you may have access to. And the challenge is that all of the platforms and all of the variability that I mentioned, whether it's cloud, SaaS, data, on-prem, and each one of those categories has multiple options and multiple iterations, they all handle permissions independently and uniquely. You know, we've all leveraged and we've all benefited from single sign-on and multi-factor authentication. Heck, even in our personal life, we are offered the opportunity to have a single sign-on experience, which is great from a user experience perspective. And it's also pretty good from a security perspective because you can keep beefing up your authentication factors to allow your credentials to be much safer. But on the roles and permissions and resources side, you don't have that you don't have that option. You don't have that consolidated option. Each platform manages roles, permissions, and resources independently. So this gets really, really complicated and it gets really, really highly variable, and it does both of those things really, really quickly. We believe fundamentally that permissions are the foundation of identity security and therefore must be the foundation of the next generation identity platforms. So the new data model that we're basing our future of identity security and where we think we need to go is what we call the access graph. But this concept is basically a new data model. This isn't about one platform or one specific product, but the new data model here is an access graph using graph technology. But the directory structures, the tree structures, the relational structures can't cope anymore. They don't have the level of variability. They don't have the capabilities required to solve this problem. So the access graph, which basically takes all components of what I call the identity access chain. So you have your identities, you have your groups, which a lot of times exist in your IDPs, whether it's Microsoft, whether it's Okta, whether it's Ping. And then you have your roles, permissions, and resources. Like I mentioned, each one of those are on the various platforms. The graph allows you to stitch these together and link these together so you can understand how identities get access to all the way down to the resource level. You can start from the resource level and work back to the identities that have access to it. And you can understand based on these linkages how they get that access, how that access is effective. Many organizations try to manage access by putting identities in groups. But as I mentioned before, permissions and resources are managed on these platforms independently. So a lot of those times that these linkages and the path can be broken. And you get what we call effective permissions, which is the permission that you have down to the resource level for an identity is an amalgamation of this path. And oftentimes what you see is on the right hand of this graph, you may see permissions and resources being managed local to that platform and not corresponding to changes made on the left side of this graph, identities and groups. So Mike Wheeler, for example, may have write access to a sensitive revenue recognition table because that access was granted on the platform at the resource level. There was no corresponding group change. Maybe there was no role change. So the effective permission's been updated, even though the path back and forth didn't maintain that level of consistency. Everything I just described is multiplied by all of your users and all of the roles and all of the permissions and all of the resources that your users have access to. Like I said, this gets really, really big really fast. A lot of organizations, the combinations will be numbered in the billions when you think about all these combinations. So the data model must be built to cater to this level of complexity. The other thing it has to do is it has to understand down to the resource level. Getting access to a platform, whether it's Salesforce, whether it's AWS, whether it's O365, whether it's Azure, front door security, as I like to call it, isn't good enough. You need to understand what the level of permissions that you have down to the resource level. And like I said before, given the complexity and the variability, the other thing that a good access graph has to be able to provide is it has to provide a standardized approach here, because given all the variability, not many organizations are going to be able to keep track of how all this stuff is managed, because each one of these platforms uses its own taxonomy, uses its own language, uses its own structure. Salesforce is different from Snowflake, is different from GitHub, is different from AWS S3, it's different from O365. So a good access graph needs to consolidate this down, standardize the language, so that you understand, for example, who has the fundamental ability to create or update data, because obviously those are the types of things that could impact the integrity of your data. Who can delete data? Maybe if it's read-only, it's not a huge deal. But understanding these different access patterns and these different levels of access is important, regardless of how complicated the individual platforms want to manage this. So the standardization component is really, really important as well. And lastly, I would say is you have to be able to understand and do this for all identities, not just human. You need to understand machine identities as well. There's plenty of solutions out there that are pretty good at understanding credentials and understanding maybe how secrets are vaulted or things like that. But again, back to my point before, what permissions exist? What can they actually do? What actions can they take? That question is critical for both human identities and non-human identities across the board and at scale. Another piece that we're seeing and what we're rallying around here is recognizing that identity security converges on two paths. There's the security path and then there's the governance path. So what I mean by that, in many of our organizations, maybe we deal with this in different organizations, so it's important that we recognize how these two groups and how these two functions, how these two mindsets need to come together. But if you think about all the complexity I mentioned, all the variability I mentioned, your identity and your permissions in aggregate is a significant piece of your security posture. So your attack surface is based on the level of permissions that all your identities have. So understanding that, getting insights, intelligence, and the ability to look at these various patterns and look for over-permissioning, look for dormant permissions, look for toxic combinations, what to call them. All of those things allow us to reduce the vulnerabilities on the identity and permission side. And it's a real powerful security and risk reduction mindset. Recognizing where are you vulnerable on the SaaS side, where are you vulnerable on the data side, where are you vulnerable on the cloud side. And oh, by the way, nobody just uses one of those types of platforms. So understanding that horizontally and consistently is really, really important. Then on the right side, you have the governance side. How is access being granted? How's it being revoked? How's it being provisioned? How's it being reviewed? So all of the governance pieces of identity, which are a lot of those are procedural. Maybe they're links to service desks. Maybe they have an operational slant to them. But the governance aspects of this are very, very important as well. We've seen a lot of the, I'll call it, capabilities in this space and the focus in these two spaces operate and march independently, but we believe that they need to come together. No security group, frankly, should be operating without recognizing that what they're doing has important and critical enablement for their business. And we're all dealing with various elements across our business that are making everything I just described even harder and driving. And we can be in a position that if we build this right and enable this foundationally, we can be in a much better position to enable business initiatives. So when you think about, for example, some of the open banking and payment innovation that we're seeing, of the connectivity that we need, all of that requires a new way of looking at permissioning. Think about the digital banking transformation that's going on, the ability to deal with customer identity versus just employee or workforce identity. The numbers are obviously much, much higher. And you want to be in a position to offer and build the right level of experience and the optimal experience, which shouldn't be burdened by all sorts of account checkpoints and access checkpoints if they're not necessary. AI and machine learning is a significant driver here because the way AI works behind the scenes is a bunch of machine identities being trained on and accessing data. So recognizing and understanding how both AI and ML are interacting with your data and recognizing how important it is to understand who has access to that data, whether it's training data or whether it's the data that's live and actually being queried by these AI models. It's really, really important, especially when we start thinking about the future of things like agentic AI, where an agent needs to basically take on the access pattern of the person requesting it. How and where can that be done? And is it done properly? I mentioned before regulatory compliance. Most regulatory requirements are fundamentally rooted in being able to demonstrate appropriate access control. So having the right level of reporting, the right level of demonstrating control, all of that is really, really important from a regulatory perspective. Everything I just described is changing so frequently that it has to be dynamic, it has to be automated. And just when you think everything is under control, you're going to have an acquisition, or you're going to have a business unit expansion, or some other major restructuring change. It's going to introduce new platforms, new ways of business, new challenges, and you have to be able to pull that in and have some level of consistent visibility to it. So integrations and acquisitions are really, really important trigger point, and frankly, a necessary business initiative that we have to enable. And last but certainly not least is our partners. Everything in this world nowadays is partner-driven, partner-rich. You may hear this talked about as your supply chain. Supply chain used to just be about, what kind of packages or what kind of raw materials would you buy to make your product. But now partnership is a huge element in the digital world. Your outsource partners, your service partners, your collaboration partners, all of those partners that have access to your environment, you're exchanging data with, they're accessing your system, you're accessing theirs. All of that is an important element of making sure that you have the necessary visibility of how that's impacting your identity security overall as well. Zero trust is a pretty important buzzword, and it's a necessary, in my opinion, it's a necessary and logical step and path from an architecture perspective, because you can no longer predict or drive consistency on your endpoints. You can no longer predict or drive consistency in the network. And as I mentioned before, your resources and your data are all over the place on highly variable platforms. So the only point I wanted to make here was that it's critical from an access control perspective. Access control and these permissions that I mentioned is a fundamental piece of zero trust. Because the last thing, frankly, that we have to make decisions on is the identities and the data they need access to. Everything else is so highly dynamic and changed so much, but identities will always need access to data. So understanding the access control component of that, and via the access graph I mentioned, is a really, really important area to helping enable zero trust as well. Most businesses require the flexibility and the speed and the elasticity of the cloud. And once you choose to do business in the cloud, you start to choose to do business with so many different partners, et cetera, and consumers that can come from anywhere. You're living in the world of the internet, and you therefore are marching down the zero trust path. One of the last concepts I want to talk about here is least privilege. Those of us who've been doing security for a while have been talking about least privilege forever. But least privilege is something that we can finally achieve and march towards if we understand and can control the level of access people have. First and foremost and fundamentally, the best way to secure your environment is to limit who has access to it. But of course, business pressures and the change of business makes that difficult sometimes, because frankly, it's the easiest thing to do just to provide more access so they're not disrupted and they're not being encumbered or see obstacles in doing their job. But least privilege is something that with the right visibility, the right analytics, and the right intelligence, that we can achieve at scale. And there's three pillars of least privilege that's important to understand. And algorithmically and data-wise, based on the data model I mentioned, how all of these come together and is consistent and self-updating and self-healing is where we start to truly achieve least privilege. And the three pillars of least privilege that we think about is what access can I take? What do I have? What permissions do I have? That's part one. What access should I have? Based on my job, based on my role, based on the project that I'm on, based on what I've been asked to do from a role perspective. What's the access I should have in that role that I'm performing for the company, whether it's an employee or a partner or something else? Then the third part of least privilege is the access that I've actually taken. What have I taken? What has that person done in the past? That's basically almost behavioral. It's your activity. So all three of those things should be as consistent as possible. And with the necessary data and the structures of the access path I mentioned, we now have a foundational data model that we can look for anomalies, we can adjust, we can pivot, we can make proposals, we can intelligently make governance decisions to bring these three pillars together. The result, in our mind, is what we like to call intelligent access. So the ability to automatically grant and revoke as close to real time as possible based on those three areas I mentioned: activity, business need, et cetera. And as I mentioned before, it needs to be fundamentally across all your systems, across any type of identity. It needs to be based on permissions and not just front door security. It needs to be simplified so you can understand the various permissions consistently, no matter how variable they are under the covers at the platform level. And you need to automate as much as possible because the size and complexity of this gets really, really big. And think about how your posture of access will improve over time with this intelligence. Your over-provisioned access reduces. So you're moving toward true least privilege and you're de-risking the environment. And then the other thing you can do is with continuous monitoring intelligence, you can reduce ad hoc requests. Wouldn't it be nice if you didn't have to do so much quarterly access reviews, because you're much more confident that your access is appropriate, and you wouldn't need to call the help desk to ask for access because the engine under the covers is granting you that access because it learns that you need it based on your activity and based on your role. So all of these come together to build what we believe is the future of identity security, much needed disruption. And I thank you for your time, and we appreciate the opportunity to present today.